In the blistering heat of 1857, the city of Delhi was the stage for one of the most brutal and, frankly, most important conflicts of the entire 19th century. The siege wasn't just about taking a city. Oh no. It was about the fate of a rebellion, the end of an empire, and it would completely reshape the future of India. Okay, so let's just stop and think about this for a second, because this is the crazy part of the whole story. You've got this tiny British force showing up to lay siege to the massive walled city of Delhi. But for months, they're the ones who are outnumbered, outgunned, and totally pinned down, literally fighting for their lives. This wasn't a normal siege at all. It was this bloody, grinding stalemate where the attackers felt like they were the ones under attack. So how in the world did we get here? Well, this conflict didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was the explosive result of decades of tension that had been simmering away between the Indian soldiers, we know them as sepoys, and the people they worked for, the powerful British East India Company, which had been, for all intents and purposes, running large parts of India for 100 years. You can just see it building, one thing after another. The sepoys saw these as huge insults. First, the British just take over Oudh, which was the home of a ton of these soldiers. Then, there's a new rule that says they have to serve overseas, which for a high caste Hindu, well, that meant losing your caste. A huge deal. But the final straw, the one that lit the fuse, was the new Enfield rifle. To load the thing, you had to bite the cartridge, and the rumor spreading like wildfire was that these cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, which is deeply offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. So on May 10th, the sepoys at Meerut just had enough. They rose up, and they all started marching straight for Delhi. And believe me, their choice of Delhi was no accident. This wasn't just some random city. It was the symbolic heart of India. Capturing it transformed a mutiny into a full-blown revolution almost overnight. See, Delhi gave the rebellion a sense of legitimacy. It was the ancient capital of the Mughal Empire, the dynasty that had ruled India for centuries. And the elderly Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, well, he became the, let's be honest, very reluctant face of the whole uprising. With the emperor on their side, rebel regiments from all over northern India started pouring into the city. And here's the real kicker. They captured the Delhi magazine, a gigantic arsenal, which gave them modern weapons and what seemed like an endless supply of ammo. The difference between these two armies was just huge, but not just in the way you'd think. The rebels had this massive advantage in numbers. We're talking at least 40,000 troops with the same modern guns as the British, but their biggest weakness? They had no single leader. Their command structure was a total mess, just filled with rivalries and a deep mistrust between the soldiers and the emperor's court. The British, on the other hand, started with this tiny force, maybe 3,000 guys, but they were disciplined, and for the most part, they had a clear chain of command. And that one difference really set the stage for a long, brutal stalemate. So since they couldn't just storm this massive city, the small British force did the only thing they could. They dug in on a rocky hill just outside the walls, a place known as the Delhi Ridge, and it was from here that they were going to try to pull off this so-called siege. And that really was the reality for months. The rebels in the city, with way more men and better cannons, just launched attack after attack on the British positions. So the British weren't really besieging Delhi. They were desperately just trying to hold on to their tiny piece of ground on the ridge, fighting off attacks from the city every single day. I mean, just look at this. It's insane. We're talking more than 10 to 1. For those British soldiers stuck on that ridge, every single day was a battle for survival against an army that could have, at any point, just completely wiped them out. And you know, if the constant attacks weren't bad enough, the conditions were something out of a nightmare. Temperatures were soaring over 43 degrees Celsius. Disease, especially cholera, was absolutely everywhere. The British force burned through 3 different commanders in just 2 months. 2 of them died from cholera. Then the monsoon rains hit, turning everything into a sea of mud, which was followed by these disgusting swarms of flies. Wow. That quote from a young officer, it just paints such a visceral picture of how miserable daily life was. It wasn't just about the fighting. It was about surviving the heat, the sickness, and the filth, day in and day out, all while being surrounded by this enormous enemy army. For almost 3 agonizing months, this stalemate just dragged on. But then, in late August, the balance of power finally started to shift. Reinforcements. They finally arrived from the Punjab, and they were led by a man who had completely changed the course of this siege, Brigadier John Nicholson. And just as importantly, a massive siege train also showed up, carrying the heavy artillery they needed to finally break through Delhi's huge walls. After months of being on the defense, the British could finally go on the attack. And Nicholson was absolutely the man for this job. He was only 34, but he was already a legend. Incredibly brave, charismatic, and just utterly ruthless. One historian even called him the great imperial psychopath. I mean, this guy was so aggressive that when his own commanding officer hesitated to order the assault, Nicholson basically threatened to fire him and take over himself. So with Nicholson pushing everyone forward, the plan was locked in for dawn on September 14th. It was this really complex, four-part attack. First, for 2 straight days, British cannons would pound the northern walls to punch some holes in them. Then, the first 2 columns would charge right into those gaps. At the same time, a third column had maybe the riskiest job of all, to literally blow up the heavily defended Kashmir Gate with explosives. And finally, a 4th column would attack to the west, just to create a diversion and pull rebel soldiers away from the main fight. I mean, can you even imagine this? The mission to blow up the Kashmir Gate was pretty much a suicide mission. With bullets flying everywhere, this tiny group of engineers sprinted forward, planted the explosives, and lit the fuse. Most of them were killed or wounded in the process, but they did it. The gate was blown to smithereens, and the third column poured into the city. It was just an act of unbelievable, almost insane bravery. But getting inside the city walls, that was just the start of the horror. The cost was staggering. On that first day alone, over 1,000 men were killed or wounded. That included John Nicholson himself, who was shot and would later die from his wound. And what came next was a full week of the most brutal house-to-house, street-to-street fighting you can imagine, as the British, slowly and very bloodily, fought for control of the city. On September 20th, the city was finally declared captured, but the violence, it was far from over. What came next was a period of absolutely brutal revenge. The fate of the Mughal royal family really symbolized the end of a whole era. The Emperor, Bahadur Shah, he surrendered after being promised that his life would be spared. He was put on trial, exiled, and he died pretty much forgotten. His sons, though, they got no such promise. They surrendered to a British officer named Captain William Hodson, who just shot them dead right there on the spot. And with their deaths, the Mughal dynasty. The fall of Delhi was a massive turning point. The city was completely sacked, and thousands of people, suspected rebels and ordinary civilians, were killed in revenge. And the political consequences were enormous. The British government dissolved the East India Company, took direct control of India, and started the era we now call the British Raj. The fighting would drag on in other places, but the rebellion had lost its symbolic heart, and it had lost its leader. So we're left with this really critical question, and it's all about perspective. The capture of Delhi broke the back of the 1857 uprising, for sure. But it also kicked off a new and often much more brutal era of British rule. And it leaves us wondering, how should we remember this? Was it the British putting down a mutiny, or was it the crushing of a nation's first real fight for its freedom? And the truth is, even today, the answer you get depends entirely on who you ask.